In this video, we're going to cover a reading comprehension strategy that you can use to get a higher score on the GED Reasoning through Language Arts section. And this strategy I'm going to talk about today is called the SQR3 method. Now, this method was developed by Dr. Francis Robinson, who had his PhD in experimental psychology, and he originally developed this method to help people in the military improve their reading comprehension. And there's all kinds of evidence for this strategy. This has been used for a while. What I basically want you to know is that in this video, I'm going to first show you how the method works, and then I'm going to teach you how you can adapt it to the GED passages, and then I'm going to show you an example of how to apply it. And I really want to help people that are struggling with reading comprehension, and whether or not you follow the method exactly when you take the GED test, I want you to hopefully take away some things from this that can definitely help you out. So first, what does SQR3 mean? The S stands for survey. You're going to survey the text before reading to understand the topic and the main idea. If I could just get you to spend just a little bit more time surveying the text and previewing what you're going to read before you jump into reading, I think it might make a big difference for you. Surveying also just means things like looking at the title and the headings, any subheadings that are present in the text. And then any pictures and graphics. Pictures are going to be pretty self-explanatory, but graphics could be things like graphs or charts or numbers. You don't have to really process them and take them all in at first. In the survey phase, you're just kind of skimming them, just looking at them, just to kind of prime your brain for what's going to come. Surveying also involves skimming. So skimming things like the introduction, like the first paragraph, skimming the conclusion. This could also be paying attention to the first and last sentences in the paragraphs. So just some ideas here, but surveying for you could also be just skimming through the text. In the traditional method, you're to write down any questions that you have from looking at the headings and pictures. Now, we're going to, like I said, we're going to look at how you can adapt this to the GED because you're probably not going to have time to actually write these down, but you can, of course, think about in your head what questions you have from looking at the headings and the pictures. And the reason why you want to do this is because it's going to help you focus on the main ideas as you read. And it's just going to help you focus in general because some people, with that time ticking down, it can be hard to keep your focus on the test, especially as you feel anxiety or stress over reading. So just by thinking of questions before you read, it's going to help keep your focus on the text. Now, the third step is read, and like I said, this is where a lot of people start. They just jump right in and try to read, and that does work for people who are already pretty good at reading comprehension, but for those that have difficulty, I wouldn't recommend just jumping right into the reading. But when you actually do the reading, the point here is that you're going to read the passage or the story, whatever it happens to be, and you're going to focus on finding answers to those questions that you came up with as you read. Then the next step, so there's 3 R's. The first R, it's SQR3, the first R being reading. The second R is to recite. So you're going to recite the main ideas. You're going to recite what's happening. So this could be you read, you pause, and like you look away from the text or look away from the screen and try to put in your own words what you just read. This could also be reciting things like you've come across an answer to one of the questions you thought of, and you want to look away and kind of put that in your own words. And obviously you can write this out. It's probably better when you're practicing to write it out, but on the test you're going to want to do this probably in your head. You certainly don't want to say it out loud, but you could write it out. And reciting is going to help you boost your memory. It's going to help you figure out what you're not understanding, and this is a really key point. To improve your reading comprehension, as you're reading, you want to always get in the habit of just pausing and asking yourself, do I understand what's going on here? And if not, you want to go back and reread that paragraph, reread the sentences to try to figure out what you're not understanding. All right, because oftentimes when you're confused about a text, there might just be 1 or 2 key details that you're missing. If you can figure those out, it might really just kind of help the light bulb go off as you're reading. And you're also reciting just helps you make sure you're answering those questions that you came up with as you read. And then review, the third R is just to review. You want to review what you've learned as you go along. And you want to ask yourself, did you answer all of your questions? Now, that's the traditional SQR3 method, and you might already be wondering, how is this going to apply to the GED test? How can I use this to boost my score on the GED test, right? So I can get this test done, get it done faster, get a higher score, and have less stress, because when you're reading passages and the time's ticking down, It is stressful, at least for a lot of people. So that's what we're going to talk about now, and I want to give you some suggestions to help you adapt this method, because if you just take the traditional method, it's going to help you out. And hopefully you've already learned something that's going to be useful to you in this video so far, but I want to give you some better ideas here. So you're going to first, again, I want you to read the title of a passage whenever you see it and ask yourself if you know anything about the topic already. I don't care, maybe the topic's about diamond mining and you don't know anything about diamond mining, but I want you to pause and think, hey, this title has something to do with diamond mining. Do I know anything about this? No, I don't. But just asking yourself questions as you read like that is going to help you. And you're also going to look at the headings and the subheadings, all right? And especially, this is really, really, really important. This might be the most important takeaway from this video for some people. You want to always, if you have time, look at the questions that you're going to be answering before you read the passage. So if the time is really taking down and you're really short on time, then you can skip this step. But time permitted, I really highly recommend that you just at least glance at the questions first before you actually do the reading. And there's actually research shown that when people do this, it does increase your score. Now, everyone's going to be different, but on average, there is some data out there showing that students who read the questions first tend to get higher scores. Also surveying, again, like I was saying earlier when I covered the traditional method, on the GED, when you get a passage or text, you can skim that text first, and you're really just kind of trying to understand what's the main idea, what's the big picture, and then when you actually slow down and read the text, you're going to fill in those details. And also, again, when you're surveying, look at any images or graphics for information. So the questions, and for the GED test, the questions would just be, think about any questions that you have before you read the material. And again, you probably won't have time to write these out. You just want to think in your head. So after you survey, you kind of look at the actual questions you'll be answering. You survey those, you survey the titles, anything like that. You're going to think to yourself, what questions do I have about this topic? What do I need to know to move forward with the test? And that's just going to kind of help your focus, give you some ways to keep your focus on the main ideas. Now, and then of course, you're going to just do the reading. And as you're reading, I want you to think about where in the passages you're going to find the answers to your questions, all right? You don't have to remember all of the details while you're reading, all right? Because you can go back and forth between looking at the question and going to the part of the passage that has the answer to that question. So don't get too tripped up on the details. Just remember where things are in the passage. And I'll show you what I mean when we go to the example. And this is a really, really, really big tip, and a lot of people don't do this, and I think the reason is because the testing situation can just be so stressful with the time ticking down. But take a deep breath and just try to force yourself to pause every now and then and ask, am I understanding what I'm reading? And I think a lot of people don't want to do this because it feels like it's taking up more time, right? And really, it might take a little longer to do this, but you're going to get a higher score because you're going to actually understand the text a little bit better. And so definitely I recommend when you're practicing before you take the test, practice pausing every now and then after each paragraph or every couple paragraphs and just ask, do I understand what I'm reading? And if the answer is no, you're going to want to reread it or at least reread parts of it so that you get a better idea of what's going on. Now, at the same time, if you take too much time doing this, the risk is that you'll run out of time. So you want to find a balance here. But I think between reading those questions first and, doing a little more work before just a little bit more work, just glance at those titles and stuff before you actually read. And then if you do this step here where you pause every now and then, force yourself to, in your own head, just kind of summarize what's going on. Ask yourself if you understand what's happening, and if not, review the text. I think that's going to make a big difference for you. So another quick tip here would be to look for keywords in the questions and then find them in the passage. So basically, I'll show you what I mean by this, but when you're doing your surveying phase here, before you actually read the passage, look at those questions. You're surveying the questions, and if there's like specific words or specific things in those questions, when you're reading, you want to kind of think to yourself, look for those words as you're reading, because that's probably going to tell you where in the passage the answer is going to be. So let's look at an example now of how you could put this all together for your test. So I've got a practice question right here with the passage. And so what I want to do here is go through how you would apply the SQR3 method. So before we even read the passage, let's take a look here at the title and at any photos and just survey what's going on. So the title tells us, it says Article 1, a summary of Harry S. Truman's 1947 speech on civil rights. So just from looking at this title here, I can already figure out that the time period was 1947, which is valuable because that's going to help me kind of put the setting into place here. It's going to help me create a mental picture as I read of the time period when this was taking place. Because if this was set in 2020 versus maybe, I don't know, 1800 versus 1947, the picture that you form in your mind as you read is going to be something different. And it's also giving us a character or a person. It's telling us Harry S. Truman. And it's giving us the topic, which is going to be about civil rights. So right off the bat, I know the time period, I know who it's going to be about, and I know what the topic is. So if we look at the photo here, it says in the caption, Eleanor Roosevelt speaks with President Harry S. Truman in May of 1951. She's reporting on her work as a delegate of the United Nations Human Rights Commission. So this is just showing us that she's also probably going to have something to do with the passage. So let me just click to the different parts of the passage and see if we have any other headings. And yes, we do. Here's another title or heading. Now this one says Article 2, a discussion of Eleanor Roosevelt's 1948 speech on human rights. So putting this together, now we see that we're also going to have a part that's going to be set in 1948, just 1 year later, and Eleanor Roosevelt's going to kind of be the main figure of this passage, or this part of the passage, and the topic is also human rights. So right off the bat, I see that to answer these questions, I'm going to have to go back and forth between the first article and the second article here. All right, so next we could go ahead and take a look at the questions here. So the first question says, President Truman mentioned the United Nations Commission on Human Rights during the speech to the NAACP in order to show, and it gives us some choices down here. And so I said it's always good to look for certain keywords in the questions because, and what I mean by that are specific things like this, the UN Commission on Human Rights, NAACP, things of this nature. Keep these in mind because when we read the passage, you might want to look where it mentions these things directly because those places are probably going to be where the answer is going to be. So now we could just kind of skim through this here. We could just kind of look at the first sentence in each paragraph here. It says here, on June 29, 1947, the 30-year-old President of the United States, Harry S. Truman, addressed the 38th Annual Conference of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So right off the bat, we see what the NAACP is. It tells us that in the first paragraph. Now, if we just kind of skim, the first paragraph the first sentence of the second paragraph says, opening with a determined tone, Truman urged Americans to work together to repair racial schisms. Then the first sentence of the third paragraph says, Truman did not paint a one-sided, naive picture, though. So now we can go on here, and so we can just skip to the conclusion here. It says, Truman concluded his speech by invoking words Abraham Lincoln wrote in 1862. So let's just kind of think here before we actually read this about what we're getting here. It's just telling us, so Harry Truman gave some kind of speech dealing with civil rights. He's referencing Abraham Lincoln here, has something to do with racial issues or racism. And so we already kind of have all this information here. It's also mentioning that he didn't paint a one-sided picture. He showed both sides. So we could do the same thing really with Eleanor Roosevelt's portion where it says in 1948 during her speech at the UN Commissions on Human Rights, she gave a speech called The Struggle of Human Rights at the Sorbonne in, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but somewhere in Paris, France. So this is also giving us a setting or a place. So she gave a speech. It was in Paris, France. And then it goes on to say, she began her speech by informing her audience that her purpose was to talk with them about the preservation of human freedom. So again, it's always good to just pause and ask yourself, what do we know? What are we learning right here? Eleanor Roosevelt gave some kind of speech in France about human rights, and the purpose was to talk about preservation of human freedom. And again, I guess I should probably show you the next question here. So the next question here says, what approach did Eleanor Roosevelt take to encourage acceptance of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Then as we go on to the next question would be about a whole other passage here. So we're just going to focus on these two passages here. But what I want you to see here is that if you had just gone and spent all that time reading the passage without doing any of the pre-reading, like the SQR3 method has you do, then you might not even realize that there are two different articles that you have to read to answer these questions. And so if the question, which you're given here, the question has to do with Eleanor Roosevelt. So for the questions that have to do with Eleanor Roosevelt, you're probably going to be getting those answers out of the second article. Whereas questions like the first one that deal with Truman, you're probably going to find those answers in the first article. Okay, so that's just one thing to notice here. Say you were running out of time and you didn't have time to read the whole passages, you would still hopefully know that just by doing a little pre-reading here, that if you want to look for a question, for the answer to a question dealing with Truman, you'd want to look in Article 1 and vice versa with Eleanor Roosevelt, okay? So we already have a good idea here kind of what this is about, but we can keep going here. Just look at the conclusion here. She concluded her speech by repeating a call to action from the opening statement of the assembly. Roosevelt passionately encouraged unity from the delegates and asked that they overwhelmingly approve the Declaration of Human Rights. So let's think about, and I'd like you to kind of pause the video and just think, do you have any questions about these topics? Do you have any questions, things that you'd like to know the answer to? And so I know that I'm just kind of wondering here, what specifically did she talk about here? Like it says in the conclusion, it says, she concluded her speech by repeating a call to action. Well, who's she calling to action? Is she talking to countries? Is she talking to people? We're not sure exactly yet. So that's something I want to keep in mind to look for personally as I read. The same with the Harry Truman here. He's talking about racial issues here. So one question could be, which specific racial issues does this have to do with people having equal voting rights? Does this have something to do with slavery, reparations for slavery, or just racism existing in America? What specifically, I want to ask, what specifically is he talking about here? So that's just to go through our SQR3. We've already surveyed the text. We've looked at, just kind of skimmed it here, looked at the questions, and now I'm just coming up with a couple questions off the top of my head that maybe I'm curious about. That's going to help me focus more while I read and just help generally keep me on track to focus on the main ideas. So now let's actually read this, and then we'll answer these questions together, and we'll kind of wrap this up here. So it says, on June 29th, 1947, the 33rd President of the United States, Harry S. Truman, addressed the 38th Annual Conference of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. In a speech calling for civil rights and human freedom, Truman described the efforts his administration had initiated as well as his hopes for the future. Opening with a determined tone, Truman urged Americans to work together to repair racial schisms. He suggested that the country had reached a turning point, that for the first time in its history, America was ready and willing to guarantee freedom and equality to all its citizens. He continued with an assertion that the government should protect and provide for all its peoples. According to the president, all Americans should possess decent homes, adequate medical care, worthwhile employment, and the right to a fair trial. So as you're reading, as always, just a reminder, it's great to pause and just ask yourself, do I understand what's happening here? How could I put this in my own words? If I had to put this in my own words, just off the top of my head, it's basically the president. He's giving a speech here, and more specifically here, he's talking about how the country's at a turning point here, and he says that the government should be able to protect and provide for different people. Specifically, he wants people to have good homes and adequate Medicare, and everything it says here, right to a fair trial. So that would be my understanding of what's going on so far. Then I would keep reading. Truman did not paint a one-sided, naive picture, though. At the heart of his speech was a sobering depiction of the social situation facing the nation during its post-World War II era, which included a discussion of disheartening issues ranging from racially motivated insults and intimidation to mob violence. However, he did not dwell on the grim topics, but instead cited the issues as fuel for promoting change. So this kind of answers my question. Remember, I was wondering, so this has something to do with racial issues, what specifically is going on, and I guess kind of the answer that I'm getting would be is just talking about all kinds of tragic things that are going on, from racial issues to violence, and but he's not dwelling on them. He just wants to mention them to help make future change. So I would say, okay, that answered my question I had originally. So then we go on here. After observing the complexities in expanding and improving federal laws, Truman pointed out several examples of his administration's effort to make these improvements, including the 1946 appointment of the President's Committee on Civil Rights and the request that Congress pass legislation to extend basic civil rights to people living in both Guam and American Samoa. Additionally, the President cited the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, chaired by former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, and the committee's efforts to prepare the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so at this point, I have to remember that in the question, it was asking me about United Nations Commission on Human Rights. There was something about that in the question. So I want to realize that, hey, this is the part of the passage where it says, additionally, the President cited the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. So this is probably the part of the passage where the answer to this question is going to be. So let's look at the answer choices here. So A says, how civil rights legislation worked outside of the United States. Now, has this passage really talked about what's happening outside of the United States? Not really. It's just basically saying here, from my understanding, again, we're kind of pausing and thinking, how can I put what's happening in my own words? Well, this paragraph here, paragraph number 4, it's saying that they want to pass legislation to extend basic civil rights to people in Guam and American Samoa. But the whole point of mentioning, but he's not mentioning the United Nations Committee to show anything about how civil rights works outside of the United States. He's just saying basically that he wants those people to have certain civil rights. All right, so A would probably be out. I'd probably cut that out right away. So B says his general support of civil rights in the United States and abroad. That sounds like that could be the right answer to me. C says how the United States has learned valuable civil rights lessons from other countries. So again, to answer all these questions, you really have to just check your understanding. Do I understand what's happening in this paragraph number 4 here? Okay. And like I said, if I were to explain this in my own words, just off the top of my head here, I would say, he's just pointing out examples of expanding and improving laws. He wants civil rights to be extended to people in other countries like Guam and American Samoa. And then he just cites work that Eleanor Roosevelt had already done. And so C says how the United States has learned valuable civil rights lessons from other countries. Well, this paragraph here says absolutely nothing about civil rights lessons we've learned from other countries. It just talks about extending those rights to other countries. So I would take C out. Then let's look at D. It says his belief that the United States had civil rights policies that should be adopted by other countries. So D, I could see why somebody would think this, but again, it goes back to the question. President Truman mentioned the United States Commission on Human Rights during his speech. Why did he do that? And I think that it had more to do with his general support of civil rights, both in the U.S. and abroad. So let's see if B is the right answer. And B is the correct answer here. So what I want you to take away from, and we're going to look at a second question here, but what I want you to notice here again is how easily I was able to kind of pinpoint this question here, and just pinpoint from looking at the question said United States Commission on Human Rights, blah, blah, blah. I looked at that. I figured I'm going to have to look for these words in the passage. I found right here where it talks about the United Nations Committee on Human Rights. So I figured that this paragraph is going to be where the answer is. And then I read the paragraph here. I stopped. I thought, how could I put this in my own words? And obviously, you're not going to be able to do that on the actual test. But you can stop. You're not going to be able to say it out loud on the actual test, but you can pause. You can think in your head, how can I summarize this in my own words? That's what I did. So after I had done that, then I just read down through each answer choice, and ruling the ones out that were incorrect was so much easier because I already had first clarified what the passage was actually about, what this part of the passage was about. So again, look at the question, look for keywords in that question, find the part of the passage that you think the answer is going to be, focus on that part as you're reading, and then stop, pause, put it in your own words, make sure you actually understand clearly what's happening in that part of the passage, and then just use process of elimination, and it shouldn't be that hard really. It's easy for me to say, but anyway, let's move on here to the next question. And so the question, again, to review it, it says, what approach did Eleanor Roosevelt take to encourage acceptance of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Okay. So a keyword here would probably be Universal Declaration of Human Rights, so something like that. So we're going to read until we come across part of the passage that mentions that. And if that doesn't really give us the answer, of course, we'll have to keep reading. We already kind of read the first paragraph earlier, so let me start with the second one for Article 2. She began her speech by informing her audience that her purpose was to talk with them. about the preservation of human freedom. Throughout the course of her talk, she tackled several topics, including the Commission's Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the difficulties she and members of the United Nations faced during the drafting process. So let's pause right here. Think, how would you put this in your own words? How would you explain this to somebody else? Well, the way I would do it, just off the top of my head here, the way I would summarize what happened in paragraph 7 is, it's writing about how Eleanor Roosevelt, she started giving a speech here, and she just informed the audience that it's going to be about preservation of freedom, and she talked about some of the challenges and difficulties that she had while creating a Declaration of Human Rights. So we go on, it says, in the speech, the former First Lady outlined the two components of the International Bill of Rights. The first part, Roosevelt explained, served as a declaration of the basic human rights that any individual is entitled to no matter where he or she lives. The second part, unfinished during the time she spoke, was a covenant on human rights that would be presented to every nation. It was intended that once ratified by each nation, the bill would be used as a reference to reshape any national laws that did not conform to the bill's principle. Okay, so again, if you were to pause the video and just think about this, which I encourage you to take the time and do that, how would you put that in your own words? How would you